In 2016, the United Kingdom irrevocably altered its future by a narrow 52 to 48 vote. The country chose to leave the European Union by January 2025. Nearly half of Britons believe the EU should once again be the UK's primary trading partner, ahead of the US or China. In theory, Brexit should have positioned the UK perfectly to seize new opportunities. Yet after nearly a decade of political turmoil and economic underperformance, there are few signs of progress, and discussions of rejoining the EU have started to gain traction. Deep mistrust lingered. In 1975, Britain held its first referendum on EU membership. Though the country voted to stay, anti-EU sentiment persisted and grew. Gaining momentum by the late 1990s, politicians like Nigel Farage and the UK Independence Party brought Euroscepticism into the mainstream. Focusing on three core issues: economic independence, border control, and national sovereignty. Remainers struggled to keep control of the narrative, while Brexiteers hammered home simple but powerful messages. Take back control and fund our NHS with the £350 million a week we send to the EU. With public services strained and frustration high, these slogans resonated. Yet after 5 years and 3 different governments, the eventual Brexit deal ended free movement. Granted regulatory independence and ended UK contributions to the EU budget, but at a steep price. It crippled frictionless trade with Europe. Freed from EU quotas, campaigners promised British fishermen would thrive. Instead, new red tape made selling to Europe nearly impossible. In the first month post-Brexit, seafood exports to the EU plunged 83%. British producers still had to meet EU standards, but now faced burdensome customs checks, driving up costs and delaying shipments. Instead, they pointed to Britain's successful early COVID vaccine rollout as proof of Brexit's potential. Free from EU bureaucracy, the UK became the first European country to administer vaccines, achieving a rapid early lead. But that advantage soon faded, and final vaccination outcomes were similar to EU countries. Exports to the EU are down 11% compared to pre-Brexit levels, costing businesses nearly £40 billion a year, a devastating blow for many small firms. Recent American and Chinese investments in AI dwarf Europe's efforts, highlighting the importance of aligning with major players. Brexit gives the UK the flexibility to do so, but realizing this potential requires decisive leadership. On June 23, 2016, Britain delivered its historic verdict. 52% voted to leave. Yet 10 years of stagnation show these advantages are not guaranteed. So far, successive governments have failed to capitalize on Brexit's opportunities. But change may be coming. The latest government has proposed connecting Cambridge, Oxford, and London into a tech corridor, dubbed London Silicon Valley, aiming to cut red tape, leverage regulatory freedom, and attract foreign investment. Whether this can transform Brexit's legacy from one of broken promises to real progress remains to be seen. Their arguments were amplified by a fiercely Eurosceptic media, ran sensational headlines like the infamous claim that Brussels regulated the curvature of bananas, that stoked public distrust. Net migration is at record highs. The economy is sluggish, and public services are struggling. Only 30% of Britons still believe leaving the EU was the right choice. Brexit's promises lie in ruins. Jobs lost, trade diminished, and immigration higher than ever. Even those who once cheered Brexit now wonder, what did we do? Only 13% of Britons now believe Brexit has been a success. Options ranged from a hard Brexit severing all ties with EU law to a soft Brexit leaving the political union but staying aligned economically. The Norway model, which would mean remaining in the European Economic Area to retain market access while reclaiming some sovereignty. But even beyond these frameworks, there was fierce disagreement on how to use Brexit's newfound freedoms. Some wanted aggressive deregulation, others favored protective tariffs to support British industries. As a wealthier member state, it paid more into the Union than it received, funding initiatives to support poorer countries. Another EU pillar was the free movement of people, originally designed to allow workers to move freely for job opportunities. But over time, this evolved into unrestricted migration, which became increasingly controversial, especially after the EU's 2004 expansion added 10 countries, including Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. While France and Germany imposed temporary restrictions on immigration from these new states, The UK did not, leading to a significant influx of Eastern European migrants. Over 1 million arrived within a decade, many working in industries like construction and hospitality, boosting the economy, but also intensifying concerns about wages, housing, and public services. Could it ever have lived up to its grand promises, or was it doomed from the start? By the time of the Brexit referendum, growing tensions around sovereignty and immigration had many questioning whether EU membership still offered net benefits, especially since the 2008 recession, Britain's economy had stagnated. With GDP per person failing to grow and falling behind the US, pro-Brexit voices increasingly blamed the EU for the UK's economic woes, arguing that Europe was holding Britain back. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why did we leave in the first place? Yet years later, many on both sides barely remember what EU membership felt like. Did we truly benefit from our time in the EU, or were we fortunate to leave when we did? To grasp Brexit's modern consequences, we must first understand why so many Britons wanted out. Unlike France and Germany, which embraced European integration as a peace project after World War II, Britain's worldview was shaped by its empire and its island mentality. The UK's sense of separation was strengthened by the fact that it was never invaded during the war, fueling a deep belief in political sovereignty. Some Brexit supporters still insist the problem is that Brexit hasn't been done properly, but exactly what that means has never been clear. There has never been a unified vision of what Brexit should look like. Some envisioned a deregulated Singapore and Thames, while others wanted high tariffs to protect local industries. For many supporters, this was the realization of a long-held dream, a chance for prosperity, economic growth, and regained control over borders. But nearly a decade later, the promises that so many had pinned their hopes on lie shattered. By 2023, Brexit had cost the average Briton nearly £2,000. Almost 2 million jobs had vanished nationwide, rather than shutting Britain off from the world. The country's borders have welcomed over 4 million new arrivals since 2016, more than double the number in the previous decade. For most people, the broken promises of Brexit are painfully obvious. Meanwhile, Europe's influence on the global stage has waned, with the US and China emerging as dominant superpowers. Since the referendum on June 23, 2016, Brexit has defined British politics and divided families, sparking countless heated debates. Even after joining the European Economic Community in 1973, the UK's relationship with Europe remained largely transactional, focused on trade, not shared political ideals. Economically, the UK was one of the EU's biggest contributors. Although studies showed these effects were marginal overall, the narrative that immigration was out of control gained traction. As the 2016 referendum approached, a grueling campaign ensued. Nearly a decade later, the reality of Brexit is stark. At its core, Brexit had a fundamental flaw. There was never a clear plan for what leaving the EU should look like. Ultimately, the UK wanted the best of both worlds, freedom from EU constraints but none of the costs, and politicians promised exactly that. Perhaps no sector illustrates this better than Britain's fishing industry, once touted as a Brexit winner. Brexiters argued that these costs would be offset by new trade deals with countries beyond Europe. But the deals that did materialize have been underwhelming. Meanwhile, Brexit's immigration promises also fell apart. The campaign stoked fears that Turkey would soon join the EU, unleashing 77 million potential migrants into Britain. Though Turkey never joined, the fear took hold. By 2015, 71% of Britons cited immigration as the country's most pressing issue. Brexiters blamed the EU, claiming that only by leaving could Britain control its borders. Yet since Brexit, migration has hit record highs, with 1.2 million new arrivals in 2023 alone, around 2% of the UK population entering in just 1 year. Far from tightening borders, Brexit appears to have opened them wider. The referendum campaign itself was rife with misleading claims. Remainers warned Brexit would cause an immediate recession and cost 1 million jobs in 2 years, fears that proved exaggerated. Meanwhile, Brexiteers plastered buses with slogans claiming we send £350 million a week to the EU, let's fund RNS instead, ignoring rebates that reduced the true cost to around £150 million a week. In reality, Brexit's settlement alone is expected to cost over £30 billion, plus an estimated £140 billion in lost economic value. As time passed, even Brexit supporters admitted it was unlikely to save the Treasury money. Still, Brexit could yet bring opportunities, sieved. Europe's geopolitical clout is shrinking as the world pivots toward the US and China, especially in strategic sectors like artificial intelligence. Britain has tremendous assets, world-class universities, a leading financial sector, and decades of economic strength.